There's a hillside here where thousands of insects flash on the same beat and nobody can say what starts them. There are meadows sitting on mountaintops that should be solid forest. With no agreed reason, they stay open. And there are tens of thousands of living things inside this park that have never been given a name. Most folks photograph one fogged-in overlook and figure they've seen the Smokies. But by the time we reach number 1, you'll understand why the strangest thing in these mountains isn't a place you can drive to, hike to, or photograph at all, and why the people counting it keep falling further behind. Number 18. The postcard made of pollution. The thing this entire range is named for is something nobody can predict from one afternoon to the next. Stand at Newfound Gap, up on the state line at just over 5,000 feet, and watch the ridgelines stack away from you in shades of paler and paler blue. The Cherokee called this place Shakanage, place of blue smoke, centuries before a tourism board ever printed it. The broad chemistry is settled. These forests exhale enormous volumes of organic compounds, which react in sunlight, form fine particles, and scatter light toward blue. That's the outline. What stays open is exactly how temperature, humidity, plant chemistry, and particle size combine to produce one specific shade over one ridge on one afternoon, something researchers still model rather than close. And there's a second problem tangled into it. For most of the last century, sulfate pollution drifting in from outside thickened that haze badly enough to cut a 50-mile view down under 10, and separating the natural signal from the industrial one is work still going on. The most photographed feature of America's busiest park is a haze we named, branded, and sold, and still can't fully account for. Number 17. Cold that shouldn't be there. Somewhere on these slopes, in the dead heat of August, there is ice. This is a pattern that runs the length of the Appalachians, jumbles of collapsed boulder, where cold air pours up out of the dark underneath. You'll find them here in the talus below the high ridges and up and down the range beyond it. Stand at one of those vents, sweating in July, and feel the cold roll over you from inside the mountain. The broad idea is straightforward. Dense winter air settles into the lower voids and drains out slowly through the warm months. But that doesn't close it, because the behavior varies wildly from one formation to the next. Some hold their cold into midsummer. A nearly identical jumble a ridge over holds none at all, and pinning down which conditions decide it is still messy, unfinished work. People found these spots long before refrigeration, a reliably cold room inside a mountain in a southern summer, with no explanation anyone could have had. Nature built a cold cellar in the rock and never posted the rule for which ones it keeps. Number 16. The valley they emptied. Every cabin on the Cades Cove loop is real. The community is not. 11 miles of one-way road circle a flat limestone floor ringed by peaks past 4,000 feet, and along it sit log churches, split-rail fence, a working grist mill, cabins with the chimneys still standing. What almost none of the visitors register is that this was a living settlement, well over 100 households, farms, worked for more than a century, until the land was assembled for the park. The buildings were preserved. The people were not permitted to stay. Some fought it, some took lifetime leases and watched their valley become a tourist drive around them. Their churches hold cemeteries full of families moved off the ground their relatives are buried in. Then most of the other structures came down, with a curated handful left to represent pioneer life. And here's what was never settled: which buildings got saved, which got flattened, and on whose reasoning. The paperwork that would answer it was never complete. Visitors photographed those cabins as scenery. They're photographing an eviction, edited. Number 15. Tennessee's secret rainforest. Tennessee does not advertise itself as rainforest country, which is an oversight of about 30 inches of rain. Take the Greenbrier Road east out of Gatlinburg and walk 4 miles up to Ramsey Cascades. You hear it a full minute before the trail turns. 100 feet of water dropping in stages into a pool. Getting there means passing tulip poplars too wide for two people to reach around, moss on every horizontal surface, ferns growing out of the fallen trunks. The valley floors take roughly 55 inches of rain a year. The high peaks take over 85. Those are temperate rainforest numbers in the humid American South. Around 100 native tree species grow inside this park, more than in all of northern Europe. The reason is that the ice sheets stopped north of here, so species retreated into these coves instead of dying out. But which coves actually served as refuges, and why a species held on in one and vanished from an identical one, a ridge over, is reconstructed from pollen and inference. It is not known. The Smokies don't just look old, they're old, and what they wrote down has gaps in it. Overlooks, cold rock, an emptied valley, a rainforest nobody advertises. Every one of those you can still walk up to and stand in. That's about to change, because the next stretch lives inside timber records, lease files, and one hillside that runs on a clock nobody set. Let me stop for a second and tell you why I'm the one talking, and then I'll leave it alone. I don't work for the Park Service. I'm not a guide. What I do is sit in county archives, old survey reports, and federal files nobody has pulled in 30 years, the kind of paperwork that's boring right up until the moment it isn't. That's where you find out a road was promised and quietly never built. That's where you find out a mountain carried the wrong man's name for a century and a half. And that's where you find the ones that never got answered at all. The sounds, the lights, the meadows nobody can account for, the files that just stop. I gathered those into a book. It's called the Appalachian Mysteries Collection, and the link is down below this video. If you want it, it's there. That's the last I'll say about it, because the next one is where these mountains stop cooperating. Number 14, the trees too steep to cut. Almost this entire park was clear cut, which makes what survived nearly impossible to believe. Take the Madron Bald Trail off the highway and climb about 3 miles to a short loop through Albright Grove, where a single tulip poplar trunk stands wider than a car is long, in shade that never fully lifts. Nothing here has ever been taken. In the first 30 years of the last century, logging outfits stripped these mountains at industrial scale, whole watersheds shaved down, temporary rail grades run up the hollows, roughly 2/3 of the future park cut. You can still find those grades under the leaf litter, and yet a handful of coves were never reached, leaving what's now one of the largest blocks of old growth in the eastern United States. The estimates run above 100,000 acres, though that number shifts depending on how strictly you define old growth. What nobody can cleanly document is why these specific pockets slipped through. Access, terrain, timing, ownership, plain luck, all tangled together in company ledgers kept by men who were recording board feet, not history. A near primeval forest with no business standing this far east, saved by something nobody bothered to write down. Number 13, the hotel with no road. There's a working lodge near the top of the third highest peak here that no vehicle has ever reached. Mount LeConte runs to nearly 6,600 feet, and the lodge sits just below that, a few minutes under the summit. At the top, cabins, a dining room, propane heat, kerosene lamps, and a llama train that comes up the Trillium Gap Trail several times a week, hauling flour and linens in and everything else out. There's never been a serious plan for a road. The novelty is the part people repeat. The consequence is the part they don't. LeConte spends much of the year sitting inside cloud, which made it one of the most useful atmospheric monitoring sites in the East. And what researchers measured up there was fog substantially more acidic than the rain falling in the valleys below. The dead gray trunks across those summit ridges show it. What's never been separated out is how much of that killing was the acid and how much was an introduced insect, because up here, the two arrive together and no one can pull them apart. Number 12, the lights that keep time. There's a hillside in this park where the light show runs on a clock nobody set. Down in what used to be Elkmont, a logging town the park swallowed a century ago, the slopes fill in early June with a firefly called Photinus carolinus, one of only a handful of synchronous species in this hemisphere. The display runs in bursts, 5 or 6 flashes from thousands of males at once, then several seconds of total darkness across acres. Then again, like the forest breathing in code. The mechanism is understood, males lock onto each other's timing, and the pattern can be modeled. What's still argued is why. Female detection in visual clutter, competition inside a narrow mating window, predator pressure. None of it has closed the question. There's no lead firefly and no cue that starts the hill. And the timing is worse than the reason. Peak emergence swings with soil temperature by more than a week, and the park's own forecasts have missed. They run a federal lottery for a date the Beatles have not agreed to. Number 11, the town nobody could bury. Right underneath those fireflies is a ghost town the park spent a century unable to make up its mind about. Elkmont sits up the Little River Road past the campground in a row of houses locals call Daisytown. Walk it and you pass standing chimneys with nothing attached, sagging porches, paint gone gray. Doorways opening straight into rhododendron. The sequence is strange. Loggers built it as a railhead. Knoxville families turned it into a summer colony with a club and a hotel. Then the park absorbed the land. And instead of leaving, cottage owners negotiated leases that dragged on for decades. So the buildings kept aging in place, while the Park Service argued with itself over which era of its own history counted. The pioneer cabins down in Cades Cove, or the vacation houses belonging to the people who lobbied this park into existence. The argument outlasted some of the buildings. The Wonderland Hotel collapsed while it was still going on. In the end, both things happened. Some cottages restored, others flattened. And every June the crowds come for the insects and walk straight past the town without a glance. We're past the built things now. Cabins, lodges, cottages, all of that has a date on it somewhere. What's ahead is water that drowned a promise, rock that turns hostile the moment you open it, and animals nobody can find the bottom of. Number 10, the road that goes nowhere. North of Bryson City, there's a federal highway that stops in the middle of a tunnel. It runs 6 paved miles along the north shore of Fontana Lake, past overlooks nobody uses, and dead ends at an unlit concrete tunnel about 1,200 feet long. Walk through it, you'll want a light for the middle, and you come out into forest. No roadbed continues, just trail. The road was a promise. In the middle of the war, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the county, the state, and the Interior Department all signed an agreement to replace the road the new lake had just drowned. Construction started, then it stalled on cost and on rock that leached acid the moment it was cut, and never restarted. What the missing road left behind isn't scenic. The North Shore holds dozens of family cemeteries, and descendants who once drove to them now reach them on Park Service boats, a few scheduled days a year. Decades later, the county accepted roughly $52 million to close the obligation. The county got paid for a road. The graves are still on the other side of the water. Number 9, the lake built for a secret. The water covering those cemeteries is there because of a deadline. Nobody was allowed to explain. Fontana Dam stands 480 feet tall, the highest dam east of the Mississippi, holding back a reservoir that runs 29 miles along this park's southern boundary. The Appalachian Trail crosses the top of it. In winter, when the lake drops, old roadbeds and foundations surface along the shoreline, which is as close as most people ever get to the towns underneath. It went up in about 2.5 years. An absurd schedule for that much concrete. Thousands of workers ran 3 shifts around the clock and lived in a village built for the purpose. The power went to aluminum for aircraft, and then to the enormous electrical demand of the uranium work at Oak Ridge, 90 miles northwest. The men pouring that concrete were told what to pour and nothing else. They worked in the dark, on the largest thing any of them would ever build, and a good number of them went to their graves without ever being told what the hurry had been for. Number 8. The rock that poisons water. Some of these mountains turn hostile the moment you open them. Drive toward the crest and watch the road cuts. Dark, thin layered slate with a rust-orange stain running down the fill below some of them. That rock was laid down roughly 750 million years ago and then shoved dozens of miles along a great thrust fault, which is why older stone here sits physically on top of younger stone. The stacking is backwards. So is the chemistry. The formation carries sulfide minerals that are perfectly stable while buried and violently unstable the second air and water reach them. Cut a slope and it oxidizes into sulfuric acid. Road construction did exactly that, and the drainage killed aquatic life in stretches of headwater stream below. Some have recovered with treatment. Others still run too acidic for native brook trout without help. And here's what hasn't been solved. Nobody can reliably predict which exposure will go acid and which won't. Two cuts in what looks like identical rock behave completely differently. Remember Conte, where the acid came down out of the fog. Here it comes up out of the mountain, and the mountain hasn't given anyone the rule. Number 7. The Salamander Islands. The strangest population in this park is under your boots, and almost nobody stops for it. Around 1,900 black bears live here, and they get the bumper stickers, the traffic jams, the warning signs. Meanwhile, these ridges hold one of the densest concentrations of salamander species anywhere on Earth, roughly 30 of them. So many that biologists genuinely call this range the salamander capital of the world. Most belong to a family that does something close to unbelievable. They have no lungs at all. They breathe entirely through their skin, which is why they need this permanently damp forest and can't live just anywhere. Some exist on one mountain and nowhere else on the planet. Lift a flat, wet stone beside a headwater stream at dusk, and you might be holding a species with a global range of a few square miles. What researchers still can't resolve is exactly how so many closely related species split apart and stayed separate across such a compact area. Cool habitat retreating upslope is the broad answer. The fine-grained sorting isn't settled, and it's getting urgent, because that zone keeps climbing and eventually it runs out of mountain. 6 left, and this is where the careful people start running out of file. Everything from here has been studied hard, argued over for generations, and still comes back without a verdict, right down to number 1, which isn't a place at all. Number 6. The caves they sealed too late. This park closed its entire underground, and it was already too late. White Oak Sink is a basin off the Schoolhouse Gap Trail where a stream runs into a hillside and doesn't come back out. Those systems sheltered enormous colonies of hibernating bats for thousands of years. Then a fungus arrived, carried down from the northeast, and white nose syndrome was confirmed here. It attacks bats mid-hibernation, burning through fat reserves they can't replace in winter. Some species crashed by more than 9 out of 10. Counts in the affected caves went from thousands to double digits. The park closed every cave to the public and has kept them closed, which slows human-carried spread and does nothing about the fungus already inside. What nobody can tell you is whether the survivors are surviving on resistance or luck or because they were never in the worst caves. Until that's understood, nobody can say whether recovery is possible or only hoped for. Number 5. The herd that came back. This one watches you back. Stand at the edge of a field in Cataloochee Valley at dusk, and you may hear something that hadn't crossed these mountains in well over a century. The bugle of a wild elk. Cataloochee sits on the eastern edge of the park, reached over a narrow gravel road. At the bottom, open pasture, mowed, with Palmer Chapel and the old schoolhouse standing in it, and animals grazing between the buildings. Elk were hunted out of the southern Appalachians completely by the middle of the 1800s. 25 were released here at the start of this century, more the following year, and against long odds, the herd held on. It's the one thing in these mountains that went right. It also depends entirely on those fields, and the fields exist because Catalucci's families were removed, and the Park Service keeps their farmland mowed as scenery. Cades Cove lost its people and kept its cabins. Catalucci lost its people and gained a herd. What nobody can project is where it stops. The limiting factor now is a brainworm carried harmlessly by deer and lethally by elk. And no one knows what ceiling that sets. Number 4, the animal nobody can get rid of. The elk were brought back on purpose. This next one arrived by accident, and 100 years later, nobody can remove it. Early last century, a wealthy landowner stocked a hunting preserve on Hooper Bald in the mountains southwest of here, with European wild boar shipped in for sport. The fences did not hold. The hogs walked out, spread through the southern Appalachians, and interbred with feral domestic pigs until what lives in these woods now is a hybrid nobody planned. Walk a high elevation trail in spring and you'll find the evidence before you find the animal. Beach gaps and grassy slopes torn open. Root systems flipped. Ground worked over like a rototiller went through it. They eat salamanders, ground nesting birds, and the bulbs of rare high country plants that grow nowhere else. The Park Service has run a control program for decades and removed thousands of animals. It has not eliminated them, and it cannot give you a confident population number because these are nocturnal animals in 500,000 acres of steep forest. A rich man's shooting preserve failed one afternoon, and this park has been paying for it every year since. 2 left. Everything so far has been something you could at least walk to, or count, or photograph the damage from. The last 2 cannot be reached at all. One is a landscape nobody can account for, and the other doesn't have a location. Number 3, the fields that shouldn't exist. There are open grass meadows on peaks here, hundreds of feet below the tree line, and no one can say what made them. Gregory Bald sits just under 5,000 feet, Andrews at nearly 6,000, and both are accessible only on foot. The effect when you arrive is disorienting. You climb for hours through dense closed forest, then step out into 10 or more acres of open grass with a horizon. And in late June, wild flame azalea in orange, salmon, scarlet, and cream, natural hybrids with no human hand behind them, sometimes several shades on a single shrub. But the flowers aren't the puzzle, the bald is. These aren't above the tree line. Trees grow perfectly well, hundreds of feet higher on the slopes nearby. So, why do these stay open? The proposals run from grazing by Ice Age megafauna, to elk and livestock later, to old fire regimes, to Cherokee land management, to climate quirks. And after generations of study, there's still no clean verdict. Left alone, many slowly grow over, which suggests something was holding them clear that no longer is. So the Park Service mows them by hand, maintaining a landscape it cannot account for. Number 2, the streams that vanish. The most photographed valley in this park is floating on a plumbing system nobody has fully traced. Cades Cove is the busiest place inside the boundary, an 11-mile loop of open pasture ringed by peaks, and almost nobody driving it realizes they're sitting on the strangest geology in the range. The mountains around the cove are ancient, hard, weather-resistant stone. The floor of the cove is limestone, softer, soluble, riddled with the cracks and voids that water loves. Think about how backwards that is, a window of soft rock sitting in the middle of a range built entirely from the opposite. And limestone does what limestone does. Streams here run into sinkholes, disappear underground, travel through passages beneath the pasture, and surface somewhere else entirely. Cavers and geologists have traced parts of it. Parts of it stay dark. There is no complete map of where water enters this cove and where it comes back out. 2 million people a year queue up on that loop road looking for bears, parked directly on top of a system that has never been fully followed. In the one place in this park everybody assumes is already understood. Number 1. The life with no name. The strangest thing in these mountains isn't a place. You can't drive to it, hike to it, or photograph it. It's a number, and the number keeps moving the wrong way. Back in 1998, this park and a nonprofit began an attempt to identify every living organism inside 500,000 acres. Not the famous ones. Everything. Fungi, mites, midges, slime molds, the microscopic life in the soil and the streams. They expected to fill in gaps. Picture a researcher on her knees under an old-growth log with a vial and a hand aspirator, 40 feet off a trail, while 100 cars circle a parking lot behind her. Before that project, this park had records for a few thousand species, overwhelmingly the visible ones. The inventory didn't fill the gaps. It showed how enormous they were. More than 1,000 species entirely new to science have been described here since, and the working estimate for how many actually live here still runs to 60 or 80,000, an estimate revised upward as the work continues, which means most of what lives in these mountains has never been named, never been mapped, and never been checked to see whether it's already disappearing. Sit with what that means. This is not a remote jungle. It has visitor centers, gift shops, a paved road over the crest, and 12 million people a year. The fireflies nobody can schedule. The salamanders stranded on their own peaks. The meadows nobody can explain. The bats that crashed before anyone finished counting. Every one of those is the same fact wearing different clothes. We built parking lots on top of an ecosystem we have not finished discovering. The Smokies most people reduce to one fogged-over overlook are, underneath, one of the least finished places in this country, full of life we haven't named and landscapes we still can't account for. Tell me in the comments about the one near you, the trail, the cove, the stretch of woods where something happens that nobody can quite explain, because those are the ones we're hunting next. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and the next investigation is already waiting right there on screen.